Welcome to Deep Dive into Knowledge.
Welcome to Deep Dive into Knowledge. There is a very specific, very quiet instinct that resides somewhere deep within our evolutionary memory. You have likely felt it, perhaps without even registering what it was at the time. I want you to imagine walking across a stretch of ground that appears entirely solid to you. It might be a paved street, a dry field, or, the floor of a quiet valley. Everything your eyes take in tells you that you are walking on a fixed, immovable foundation. But then you feel a vibration beneath your feet. It might be the distant subterranean rumble of a passing train or the heavy footfall of something unseen. For just a fraction of a second before your rational mind catches up, a primal doubt washes over you. You realize with a sudden icy clarity that the ground beneath you is not just a surface, it is a roof. And beneath that roof, things are moving. It is a profound paradox of our modern age that we have mapped the furthest stars and we have cataloged the darkest trenches of our oceans, yet we remain remarkably blind to what exists directly beneath our feet. I mean, we can look up and see the light of dead galaxies, but dirt, rock, and sand remain absolute barriers to our vision. We sort of just assume that because a landscape looks barren on its surface, it must be empty all the way down. We assume that silence equates to absence. Nowhere is this assumption more tested than in the vast, unforgiving landscape of the Gobi Desert. When you look at the Gobi, you are not just looking at a location on a map. You are looking at an endless, ancient ocean of red sand, gravel, and bare stone. It is a place that holds its secrets with a terrifying grip. The sheer scale of it, the absolute silence, well, it suggests a world completely devoid of life. But ordinary barren sand has a way of hiding complex, ancient patterns of survival. It conceals movements and migrations that never see the light of the sun. Today, we are giving our quiet, undivided attention to a shadow that has haunted this specific desert for generations. It is a presence that exists in the whispers of nomadic herders and the margins of scientific curiosity. Today, we explore this topic in depth. But before we look at the shape of the creature itself, we must understand the silence it inhabits. What is it about the extreme nature of the Gobi Desert that allows a legend to remain hidden for so long?
Well, to really understand the secrecy of the Gobi, you have to understand its sheer, uncompromising scale. We're talking about roughly 1.3 million square kilometers of terrain.
That is just an unimaginable size, really.
It is. To put that into perspective for you, that is larger than the entire landmass of France, Spain, and the United Kingdom combined. And it is not merely the picturesque rolling sand dunes that most people imagine when they hear the word desert.
Right, the typical cinematic desert.
Exactly. Those regions, which are known as the ergs, they certainly exist and are incredibly dramatic. But much of the Gobi is composed of vast plains of shattered rock, gravel, and sparse scrubland. It is an environment of extremes that actively repels human habitation.
I think people often forget the geographical mechanics of why it is so desolate. It sits in a massive rain shadow, does it not?
Yes, precisely. The Himalayan mountains to the south act as this colossal physical barrier, blocking the rain-carrying clouds from the Indian Ocean. Because of this, the Gobi receives astonishingly little moisture.
Which means there is nothing to buffer the climate.
That is it. Without moisture to regulate the temperature, the thermal swings are completely violent. During the height of summer, the surface temperatures on the sand can easily exceed 50 degrees Celsius. And then in winter, those exact same plains can plummet to minus 40 degrees.
So any biological organism living there is constantly fighting a war on two fronts. It is fighting to retain water, and it is fighting to avoid being baked or frozen.
That is precisely the challenge. It is a climate that forces almost all living things to adapt by hiding. Survival here is entirely dependent on evasion. You must evade the sun, you must evade the wind, and you evade those lethal extremes of temperature.
So the landscape itself is almost like a vast, unmapped fortress that swallows evidence.
Absolutely. Sandstorms can reduce visibility to absolute zero in a matter of minutes. They pick up thousands of tons of material and reshape the topography entirely. When a landscape changes its own geography daily, hiding a secret becomes effortlessly easy.
Which brings us to the entity that seems to defy the very logic of that environment. The nomadic people of the region have a very specific name for it, the Algoy Korkoi. If the rule of the Gobi is that survival requires hiding from the lethal heat, how do the herders describe the physical form and behavior of this creature?
The consistency of the descriptions is quite striking, really, especially since they've been gathered from different nomadic families over more than a century. They describe an animal that is typically between 2 to 5 feet in length and roughly as thick as a human arm.
So not a small creature by any means.
Not at all. And the physical form is blunt and frankly deeply unsettling to human sensibilities, as it lacks any visible head, tail, eyes, or discernible mouth. The local name actually translates to large intestine worm, because that is precisely what witnesses say it resembles.
Oh, wow. So just a thick red tube, basically.
Yes, a smooth, fat, deeply red section of cattle intestine, rounded at both ends.
A completely featureless cylinder moving through the sand. It is almost alien in its simplicity.
It really is. It is said to move beneath the surface of the sand, much like a fish moving through water. It remains entirely hidden, except for the telltale rippling waves it leaves on the surface above it.
Like a wake in a lake, but in the sand.
Exactly like that. But the most crucial detail is when it is actually seen. The accounts insist that it emerges onto the surface only during the most lethal months of the Mongolian summer, typically in June and July, or occasionally just after a rare rainfall.
And how does it move when it is on the surface?
When it does emerge, it is described as moving slowly, sort of writhing across the hot sand with evident difficulty.
I want to pause on that point because there is a brilliant biological paradox in that description. Natural selection is a ruthless editor. If an animal has adapted to swim beneath the sand, and if the surface temperature in July is 50 degrees Celsius...
Which is incredibly lethal.
Right, which is hot enough to bake a cold-blooded organism alive. Emerging during the peak of that heat breaks the fundamental rules of survival.
It completely contradicts standard desert adaptations. Most desert creatures enter a state of estivation, which is essentially a summer hibernation, or they retreat into deep, cool burrows during those months. They become entirely nocturnal.
Exactly. To come out into that blazing heat, moving slowly and awkwardly, suggests two possibilities. Either it is a profound misinterpretation by the observer, or it is an evolutionary adaptation so strange we have yet to understand its purpose.
Yes, it's a glaring anomaly.
But surviving that heat is only half the paradox. The other half is how aggressively it defends its territory. Let us look at the architecture of fear surrounding this creature. The terror surrounding the Algoy Korkoi is not just a casual superstition whispered around a fire.
No, not at all.
It is a profound, practical terror embedded in the daily survival of the nomads. What are the specific mechanisms of lethality attributed to it?
The accounts describe three highly distinct and highly lethal methods of attack. The first is a projected substance, described as either a highly corrosive venom or an acid. Witnesses state that the creature can spit or project this substance over a distance.
And what happens when it hits something?
Whatever it strikes is killed almost instantly. The accounts specifically mention that the victim's flesh turns a corroded, sickly yellow color upon contact.
Let us explore the mechanics of that for a moment. We know that spitting cobras, for instance, can project venom. They squeeze a venom gland with specialized muscles, forcing the liquid through a tiny hole in the front of their fangs.
Right, that is a known biological mechanism.
But biological venoms act on proteins or the nervous system to cause paralysis or necrosis. They do not typically dissolve matter instantly, like a strong industrial acid.
You are quite right. A purely biological acid strong enough to instantly corrode flesh and turn it yellow would require the creature itself to possess an internal stomach or some sort of storage sac lined with a biological material completely impervious to extreme pH levels.
Which is quite a feat of engineering.
It is. While not impossible, our own stomachs contain hydrochloric acid. After all, an offensive projection of such a concentrated corrosive substance over a distance is something we simply do not currently see in terrestrial vertebrates.
The second method is even more difficult to reconcile with basic physics. You mentioned an invisible electric shock.
Yes. The creature is said to be capable of discharging an electrical current of such immense power that it can kill a full-grown camel or a human without any physical contact. The charge is said to travel either through the ground or the air.
That is fascinating because if you understand how biological electricity works, the Gobi Desert is quite literally the worst environment on Earth to attempt it.
Absolutely the worst.
Think about the electric eel in the Amazon. It uses thousands of specialized cells called electrocytes stacked together like batteries. It pumps sodium and potassium ions to create a charge. But an eel lives in water. Water contains dissolved minerals, making it an excellent conductor for electricity.
Precisely. Dry air and dry desert sand are terrible conductors. In fact, they are excellent insulators. To arc electricity through dry air without a wire requires a massive, almost incomprehensible voltage.
Like a lightning strike.
Yes, think of a lightning bolt during a storm. A biological organism cannot generate the millions of volts needed to arc a lethal charge through dry desert air into a camel standing several feet away.
So the physics make it near impossible. And what is the third method of attack?
The third method described is a defensive swelling. The creature reportedly raises the front portion of its body, inflates or pulses, and then violently explodes, sending its lethal substance outward in all directions.
Wow, that is terrifying.
The fear of this substance is so absolute that merely touching the dead, discarded skin of the creature is believed to be fatal.
An explosive defense. That actually does have some tiny biological precedence, does it not? The bombardier beetle mixes chemicals in a microscopic internal chamber to create a boiling explosive spray.
That is true, yes.
But scaling that up from a tiny beetle to a 5-foot, arm-thick creature is a massive biological leap.
It is a massive leap, and you must consider the biological cost of exploding. For an animal to essentially detonate itself as a defense mechanism means sacrificing its own life.
Which goes against the drive to survive and reproduce.
Exactly. While we see self-sacrifice in hive insects like bees or certain ants, where the survival of the colony is paramount, we rarely see it in solitary predators or scavengers, which this creature is purported to be.
That level of detailed lethality forces us to reflect on the psychology of fear within nomadic cultures. The people we are talking about are absolute pragmatists. When your entire livelihood, the survival of your family and your livestock depends on traversing a harsh environment, you do not invent imaginary monsters that restrict your own movements.
You certainly do not voluntarily surrender valuable grazing land or water sources to a fairy tale.
Exactly. Parents actively warn their children away from specific valleys. Herders attribute unexplained livestock deaths to this creature, absorbing heavy economic losses without blaming wolves or disease. They blame the worm.
Which is a very specific choice to make.
It suggests a deeply rooted lived experience. Perhaps the human brain, wired for risk aversion in a resource-scarce environment, uses the legend of the worm as an evolutionary safeguard. A culturally transmitted software patch, if you will, to keep children away from dangerous, unstable dunes or highly venomous but much smaller snakes.
That is a very compelling way to look at it. Folklore often serves as a survival mechanism, wrapping a practical warning in a terrifying, unforgettable narrative.
But for a very long time, this knowledge was entirely local. It was isolated within the borders of the Gobi. I want to shift our focus to the moment this ancient local reality finally collided with Western science. Let us look at the year 1919.
It was a remarkable moment in history, truly. In 1919, a highly formal meeting took place in Mongolia. Sitting across a table from one another were the Mongolian Prime Minister, damned and bizarre, and an American paleontologist named Roy Chapman Andrews.
Let us pause to picture Roy Chapman Andrews for a second. He is a fascinating figure to place in the middle of this mystery. He was not a quiet man of the library.
No, far from it.
He was a flamboyant, fearless museum director. He drove Dodge motor cars across unmapped sand dunes. He carried a pistol at his hip. He routinely survived encounters with bandits. And he ultimately became the widely acknowledged real-world inspiration for the fictional character of Indiana Jones.
He was the absolute archetype of the early 20th century explorer. Andrews was in Mongolia to negotiate permits for a major scientific expedition. He wanted to take a fleet of cars deep into the Gobi Desert to hunt for ancient fossils.
And I imagine negotiating with the Prime Minister was a delicate process.
It was, but the negotiations were actually proceeding quite smoothly. But then the Prime Minister leaned forward and made a highly unusual formal request on behalf of the Mongolian government. He asked Andrews if, during his expedition into the deep desert, he could capture a specimen of the intestine worm.
Imagine you are Andrews for a second. You are an American paleontologist in 1919, preparing to hunt for the origins of early mammals, and a head of state asks you to catch a venomous, exploding worm.
Andrews was completely taken aback. He had never heard of such a thing. The Prime Minister, along with the other powerful officials in the room, proceeded to describe the thick, red, venomous creature in great detail.
Did they claim to have seen it themselves?
They admitted they had not seen it themselves, but their belief in its physical reality was absolute. One cabinet minister even claimed that a relative's camel had been killed by the creature's electrical shock just a few years prior.
And how did Andrews, the trained scientist, respond to this?
With deep, polite skepticism. As a trained naturalist, he knew the biological improbabilities we just discussed. However, as a diplomat needing expedition permits, he promised to keep an eye out for it. He even agreed to bring special steel tongs to safely capture it.
The irony here is quite profound. Andrews was the man who went on to discover the very first known dinosaur eggs in the Gobi, fundamentally changing our understanding of paleontology. He is the man who brought the legend of the Mongolian Death Worm to the West by writing about the Prime Minister's request in his 1926 book.
Yes, he introduced the concept to the outside world.
Yet the ultimate adventurer never found a single trace of the creature himself. He found nothing but rocks and old bones.
It is a fascinating juxtaposition. Andrews spent years traversing the Gobi between 1922 and 1930, conducting 5 major expeditions. He was perfectly positioned, brilliantly funded, and actively looking for evidence of the creature, even if only to disprove it.
So he was putting in the effort.
He was. His failure to find it cemented his initial scientific assumption that the creature was a cultural legend, a myth born of the harsh desert, rather than a biological reality.
And when his expeditions were eventually halted by political changes in 1930, he left the Gobi, and a great silence fell over the region. For decades, the Gobi was sealed off behind Soviet restrictions. The West lost access to Mongolia entirely.
The region was essentially closed.
The legend of the worm was kept alive primarily by the nomadic traditions themselves, but there was also a rather strange literary survival during that period, was there not?
Yes, quite strangely, the legend survived through fiction. In 1944, a Russian paleontologist and author named Ivan Yefremov wrote a short science fiction story based entirely on the legend of the worm.
A paleontologist writing science fiction. That is a great detail.
It is. Yefremov had actually led Soviet expeditions into the Gobi, so he was intimately familiar with the landscape and the local folklore. His story kept the concept faintly alive in the minds of Soviet scientists and readers. But to the rest of the world, for nearly 70 years, the creature existed in a space of complete informational isolation.
So we have a 70-year gap where the desert holds its breath. What happened when those geopolitical borders finally reopened in 1990?
When Mongolia opened to the wider world again, researchers and documentary filmmakers were finally able to return to the Gobi. What they found was quite startling. Investigators began interviewing nomadic families who had never spoken to Westerners, families who were completely isolated from outside media and literature.
And I imagine their stories remained unchanged.
Perfectly unchanged. The accounts these families gave were identical to the descriptions given to Roy Chapman Andrews over 70 years prior.
Down to the specific details.
Yes. The color, the blunt shape, the specific methods of attack, the time of year it emerged, everything remained perfectly consistent across generations and across vast geographical distances within the desert. This fresh wave of testimony triggered a new era of physical expeditions.
And this is where the story introduces us to Ivan Mackerle. His approach to hunting this creature is where the line between reality and imagination becomes incredibly blurred.
Ivan Mackerle was a Czech engineer, researcher, and cryptozoologist. He traveled to the Gobi multiple times throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s. His approach was intensely methodical, driven by his background in engineering. He was not just looking for the creature, he was trying to force an encounter.
He understood a basic truth about the desert. Looking for a creature that swims beneath the sand by simply walking on top of it is entirely futile. If it does not want to be seen, you will not see it. So how did he attempt to draw it out?
He deployed some highly unconventional methods. First, he used small explosive charges to safely disrupt the dunes, hoping the sudden seismic shock would drive the creature to the surface.
That is certainly a direct approach.
It was. But more fascinatingly, he engineered mechanical thumpers. These were motor-driven devices designed to send heavy, rhythmic vibrations deep into the desert floor.
The logic behind that is actually quite sound, biologically speaking. If this creature hunts beneath the sand, it would be blind. It would have to rely on vibration to locate its prey, much like certain desert spiders, or the golden mole in the Namib Desert, which essentially swims through the sand and hunts by sensing vibration.
Exactly. Mackerle theorized that a rhythmic thumping might mimic the footfalls of a struggling animal, drawing the predator toward the source of the sound.
But there is a brilliant, almost surreal thematic loop here. Mackerle openly admitted that his thumper devices were directly inspired by science fiction, specifically Frank Herbert's seminal 1965 novel, Dune.
Yes, the parallels are impossible to ignore.
In that novel, giant sandworms are lured to the surface by rhythmic mechanical thumping. So consider the reality of this. You have a real, boots-on-the-ground scientific expedition funded and deployed in the harsh Mongolian desert using a hunting technique pulled directly from a science fiction paperback, to find a creature that itself sounds entirely fictional.
It perfectly illustrates how desperate this search had become. When traditional observation fails in an environment that vast, you have to innovate, even if that innovation comes from fiction.
He threw everything at the problem.
He did. Mackerle used the thumpers, the explosives, aerial surveys, and motion-sensitive cameras. He gathered mountains of compelling, consistent eyewitness testimony from the nomads. He dedicated years of his life to this pursuit.
And what were the physical results of all that engineering and dedication?
Exactly the same as Roy Chapman Andrews' results 70 years earlier. He found absolutely nothing.
Not a single trace.
No body, no skin, no tracks, no physical evidence of any kind. Mackerle himself, after years of dedicated searching, eventually grew highly skeptical. He acknowledged that while the Gobi is certainly vast enough to hide unknown things, the complete absence of physical proof after employing such invasive methods was impossible to ignore.
Let us ground ourselves firmly in that absence of evidence, because it is the pivot upon which this entire mystery balances. We're talking about an environment that is so dry, so perfectly suited for preservation, that delicate dinosaur eggs and millions of years old bones rest near the surface in pristine condition.
The preservation conditions are remarkable.
Yet, not a single shed skin, not a fragment of bone, not a trace of DNA from this creature has ever been cataloged by science. If we strip away the myth and apply the rigorous rules of biology, what does science actually believe is happening out there in the sand?
Scientifically, the first step is categorical elimination. Biology allows us to rule out a true worm immediately. Annelids, which are true worms, breathe through their skin via osmosis.
Right, they need a damp environment.
Exactly. They require constant moisture to facilitate the exchange of oxygen. The dry, 50-degree heat of the Gobi summer would desiccate and kill an annelid in minutes. So the creature simply cannot be a worm.
So if it is not a worm, but it moves like one, what is the most logical biological candidate?
The most credible scientific consensus points towards a reptile. Specifically, many herpetologists suggest the Tartar sand boa. This is a non-venomous snake native to the Central Asian steppes.
Let us examine the Tartar sand boa. How closely does it match the descriptions given by the nomads?
Visually, there are striking similarities. It is a snake that burrows through loose sand rather than slithering over it. It has a reddish-brown color.
Which matches the intestine description.
It does. But most importantly, it has a very stout, blunt appearance. Its head and tail are almost indistinguishable at a quick glance, which aligns perfectly with the featureless cylinder description of the worm. It reaches a maximum length of about 2 feet.
And has this theory ever been tested in the field with the local population?
It has. In 1983, a specimen of the Tartar sand boa was actually shown to Mongolian locals who claimed to have seen the death worm. Several of them confirmed, without hesitation, that this was indeed the animal they feared.
But that identification creates a massive, almost insurmountable gap in logic. I want you to think about the contrast here. On one side, you have a harmless, 2-foot-long, non-venomous snake. When it is frightened, it literally curls into a ball to protect itself.
Yes, it's very timid.
On the other side, you have a 5-foot-long, acid-spitting, electricity-discharging monster that can kill a camel from a distance. How do we reconcile that massive discrepancy? Is it purely the unreliability of human perception?
Human perception is indeed highly vulnerable, especially under extreme stress. We know from psychological studies that when a human being is flooded with adrenaline, their sympathetic nervous system takes over.
The fight or flight response.
Precisely. Pupils dilate, depth perception alters, and the brain prioritizes threat recognition over accurate detail.
The brain essentially distorts reality to keep you safe.
That is exactly what happens. If you encounter something in the desert that you have been culturally conditioned from birth to fear with absolute terror, your brain will magnify that threat. A 2-foot snake quickly becomes 5 feet in your memory. A sudden defensive hiss becomes the precursor to an acid attack.
And the electricity.
Even a static shock from a dry desert wind, which is very common in the Gobi, could be mentally linked to the creature, turning it into a lethal electrical discharge in the retelling of the story.
So the mind builds the monster out of a harmless snake. But we must also consider the alternative. Is it possible that the Tartar sand boa is merely a case of mistaken identity? Could the Gobi actually be hiding an entirely uncatalogued species? Perhaps a highly venomous burrowing reptile that simply has not crossed paths with a zoologist yet?
That is the exact tension that keeps this inquiry alive. While human perception is flawed, we must also remember the historical precedents where science was wrong and local knowledge was right.
There are quite a few examples of that.
There are. For centuries, the mountain gorilla was dismissed by European scientists as a mere tribal myth, an exaggeration of normal apes. It was not until a specimen was physically collected in 1902 that science finally accepted it.
The giant squid is another perfect example. For hundreds of years, it was considered a sailor's hallucination, a myth born of rum and exhaustion. Now, we know they exist in the deep ocean.
And perhaps the most famous example is the coelacanth. This was a fish believed by the entirety of the scientific community to have been extinct for 65 million years. Yet in 1938, one was pulled onto a fishing boat off the coast of South Africa.
And the locals already knew about it.
Exactly. The local fishermen knew exactly what it was. They've been catching them occasionally for years. In every one of those instances, the indigenous knowledge of the people who lived alongside the creature long preceded the scientific confirmation.
So we have to respect the vastness of the unknown. The Gobi Desert is immense, and its most inaccessible regions remain poorly explored by modern science.
They really do. While the biological mechanics of generating a lethal electrical shock outside of an aquatic environment are highly improbable, as we discussed, the discovery of a new, large, venomous reptile in Central Asia is not impossible. In a space as vast and hostile as the Gobi, an absence of evidence is not strictly evidence of absence.
We find ourselves standing at a deeply intriguing intersection. The Mongolian death worm exists precisely where two immovable forces meet. On one side, we have deeply rooted, multi-generational human testimony from pragmatic people who know their environment perfectly.
And on the other?
On the other side, we have the absolute silence of the scientific record. It is a space where our modern need for immediate categorized answers is utterly thwarted. What does that tension ultimately tell us?
I believe it reminds us of the limits of our own certainty. We have become accustomed to living in a world where everything is cataloged, photographed, and easily explained on a screen. The Gobi Desert refuses to comply with that expectation.
It just holds on to its secrets.
It holds its silence perfectly. Whether the creature is a psychological distortion born of extreme conditions and generational fear, or an actual, uncatalogued biological reality waiting in the deep sand, the desert's refusal to yield an answer is profoundly important. It is a mirror reflecting our own discomfort with the unknown. It proves that our map of the world still has blank spaces. And perhaps we still need those blank spaces to remind us to tread carefully, to respect the environments we do not fully understand.
That is a wonderful way to view it. We leave the Gobi Desert exactly as we found it, vast, silent, and entirely indifferent to our curiosity. It holds tightly to that space between myth and reality, refusing to surrender its shadows to the light of our microscopes. Another thoughtful topic will be explored in the next episode. Before you go, I invite you to reflect on this. If you found yourself standing at the edge of a vast red sand dune in the height of a Mongolian summer, and the surface of the sand began to ripple from below in a widening circle moving toward you, what would you believe? Until we meet again, walk gently and keep your curiosity alive. Goodbye for now.